Members are one of the ways that Town Hall can keep our prices at $5 a ticket. If you're interested in learning more about our membership or anything about Finney Neighborhood Association, check in with our Town Hall membership table after the event, and we can talk through any of that. All right. Devin Briski is a print and auto journalist. She serves as the content marketing manager for the events team at Vox Media, which produces Code Conference and Vox Conversation. Beer Explains the World, that she co-wrote, is the subject of tonight's talk. Robyn Schumacher is a brewer and co-founder of Stoop Brewing and is Washington State's first female cicerone, passing the Cicerone certification exam in 2012. Previously, Robyn was a high school biology teacher before turning her attention full-time to brewing. Please help me and raise a glass to Robyn and Devin.
All right, well, welcome to Seattle, Devin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you all for being here tonight. I don't go to a ton of town hall meetings, but I would think that a place that serves beer is probably a good location for all town hall meetings, so you might want to petition to do that. And before we get started, I want to jump right in so you can talk about the book. But first, since I've never done this before, I'm allowed to break the rules, I think. So I'm going to hand out some swag from my brewery. That's for you.
Oh my God, I'm so excited.
There you go. Looks great.
Good publicity.
And I also wanted to acknowledge the location of where we're having this conversation. Hales Ales is, I believe, the longest independently owned brewery in Washington. So, yeah. So that's quite a feat. Mike Hale is here somewhere in the room. Right there.
Wow.
So he is an icon in the industry and a hero to many here in Seattle. So thank you, Mike. And back to you, Devin. So I don't know if you know much about the Seattle beer scene here, but there are quite a few breweries. You're surrounded by about 12 breweries here within a couple square miles. So this is a big beer-educated crowd in front of you. So I know they're really excited. I really loved the book because it was a different perspective on beer than most people write about. We tend to romanticize beer quite a bit and don't really think about the history, how it affects the history of the world, the economic aspects of it. So I wanted to ask you, just to start off, from a personal perspective, how did you decide to write this book? Do you have a beer background? Do you love beer?
My family's Irish American, so there's always a lot of beer drinking in my family, and my mom's a big beer drinker. And when I was in college, I started to get into food and drink journalism, and I was always interested in economics. I actually didn't study it, but I followed it, and when I was in college, I worked at this food blog Eater, which is now part of the company I now work at today, actually. Yeah. And my job was to cover the alcohol licensing community board meetings for proprietors, bar owners, to get their alcohol license extended 1 hour from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., one more table outside. And it was, you would think it was boring because they went for hours. Like one time, one ended at like 1 a.m. And they were fascinating because there are all these people that were like these kind of smarmy bar owners, or sometimes they were not smarmy. Sometimes they were like, entrepreneurs. But they would stand in front of this panel of 5 people and like beg, basically, and really just tell, and then all these neighborhood people, and this was in the Lower East Side and the East Village, so all these really old Italian guys that have been there forever, who are sick of the NYU kids being loud, would come up and list all their grievances about the number of liquor licenses, how late the bar stayed open, and it was just so fascinating, and it made me realize like how tightly regulated alcohol was, and how it's like you go to this bar scene and you think it's all just fun and games, and behind the scenes this is like money, this is like red tape, this is city government, these are, you know, people trying to navigate this extremely profitable business. And I always just thought it was really interesting. And I met Johan Swinnen because he was a collaborator with an academic I worked for in college. And he was just looking for someone with some food and drink journalism background to see if he could adapt his book of scholarly essays to a more popular read version. And so just a disclaimer, I'm not an economist. So if there's an economics question that's not part of the book material and I don't know, I'm
not
say
either,
I don't know. So, but yeah, so the opportunity came along, and I totally agree with you. One of the reasons I loved working on this book was because I found a lot of people really have this like very idealistic vision of what beer is, and it's, like, especially in America, like what craft beer is. Yeah. And it's funny when you look at the economics because it kind of strips it of that magic, but it gives you a different perspective. You know, like we almost titled the book From Monasteries to Multinationals and Back, because the whole idea is like the Belgian monasteries monasteries all over Europe were the oldest, you know, all large-scale brewers go to multinationals. Now they're the craft brewers. And it's interesting because the role monasteries played was they were like the first at-scale commercial brewers of their time. Yeah. And now they're the super craft.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, speaking on that point, talking about the bar owners, I think one unique aspect of the beer industry, at least here in Washington, because what we know is that part of the reason we're successful here in Washington is that we have laws that allow us to do things that other states aren't allowed to do. So because our breweries are considered tap rooms, we're kind of community centers. So we have kids, we have lots of dogs. Some people love it, some people don't. But it's really a community hub, the tap rooms here in Washington. And we benefit from those, the people who are working behind the scenes at the stuff that's less fun, like you're talking about, the red tape and things like that. So I want to jump into, this book covers a lot of ground. It's the history of the world. So in 15 chapters, so that's pretty impressive. And you cover a couple of really important beer styles. You don't really talk a ton about all the beer styles in the world, but some of those really important, pivotal beer styles, one of them being porter. I love porter a lot. I actually have a dog named Porter because I love it so much. And he's 16 years old, so he's going strong, and I'm sure it has to do partly with the Beer Association. But in chapter 3 of your book, you talk about the history of porter, and not just the history of the style, but how it actually helped fund 150 some years of war for Britain. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually probably my favorite chapter in the book, and credit is due to an economist named John Nye, who is the one who actually dug through the archives of the trade laws. And what he did was, there's this myth of free trade Britain and fortress France, which is where Britain repealed the Corn Laws and ideologically made that leap into capitalism, but France didn't, and that was kind of an economics myth. And he said one day in the early 90s, I'm going to go look back and just really intensely study the trade law, and saw that Britain actually did have protectionist laws on the books, specifically ones against wine. And he wrote a book on it called War, Wine, and Taxes, and it's his magnum opus. He spent 15 years on it. It's super interesting, but the basic premise of the book is we have this idea that Britain is beer drinkers, France is wine drinkers, but in fact, in the 1600s, prior to the Glorious Revolution, France actually imported large quantities of wine into Britain, and it wasn't fancy French wine, it was cheap wine in barrels. And in 1689, the Glorious Revolution happened. I'm just going to get my notes so I make sure I get the dates right. For this one. Yeah, so and when the Glorious Revolution happened, two things basically accompanied that. Parliament was now a lot more stronger. Britain was at war for 91 years, and most of that time they were fighting, either winning or fighting on equal terms with France. And prior to this, Britain had not been considered a great military power. So the question was, how did they fund that war? Because war is expensive. So in 1689, they passed a tariff on French wine, and what's crucial here is the tariff was based on volume rather than value. So when you have a tax based on volume, what it does is it shifts demand towards higher quality goods, cheap French wine in. So that was no longer a competitor, an alcohol competitor for the masses. And during that period, the century that followed the Glorious Revolution, a couple other important things happened. The Industrial Revolution, massive urbanization, the population of London exploding. And during this period, prior to this period, brewing was really like pub owners would brew their beer for the pub. It wasn't an at-scale production, and there were a couple common brewers that would brew for many pubs, but they were small. And so in 1699, the biggest brewers in London brewed 6,700, I think it's barrels of beer. By 1760, they brewed 50,000. And the top 12 brewers brewed half of the beer in London. So it was a massive consolidation, the first of that scale that we've really had. But during this time, we also see, and they're brewing beer with a very scientific, an eye on profit. So interestingly, apparently the gentry, the sort of people with more money actually preferred pale ale, which is Coke malted barley.
Like that color.
Yeah. And porter was technically a regression. They wood malted it, but they found that it was less delicate and it would actually improve with age, so it was really designed for scale. And they could brew it on a massive scale, and the impurities would be kind of, it was just good for it. And so during this period, porter became the dominant beer in London. But ironically, what happened is that the price you would expect to fall because they were brewing it more. It was cheaper to brew beer per unit than ever before with the scale they were able to achieve. But the price actually rose during this period from 2 pennies per pint to 6 pence. It was regulated by Parliament. And so the question is what was happening here? And interestingly enough, during this entire period, there was at least one brewer in Parliament. There was like it was like a revolving door like K Street, and in Washington, D.C., it was like this with the Southwark Brewers. They were all parliamentary MPs, and yet they kept taxing themselves. And so what John Nye was able to see in what was happening is they had effectively become a cartel. So in a cartel, you need some kind of power to make sure that no one is cheating, because if someone lowers the price, then everyone they win and the others lose. And so Parliament was serving that function with its taxation. The other big component here was that prior to all these changes happening, taxes, like you can make taxes as high as you want if you're a government, but that doesn't mean you're going to actually get that revenue, because if taxes people can evade them. And so prior to all these changes, pubs would be dispersed across the British countryside. All the tax collectors would have to go out manually to every single pub and ask them, how much beer did you sell? We're going to tax you. And people could just lie. There wasn't much stopping them. And it was also just inefficient to collect a very dispersed marketplace. So when the consolidation happened, you had a couple small players. They were relying on the government for the price controls to keep it expensive so they could charge money. And they also there were fewer players to collect taxes on. And it served as a kind of check with like the MPs and the brewers working together to extract this massive amount of money from the working poor people.
Yeah, you're probably not aware of this, but it kind of reminded me, we just passed a sweetened beverage tax in Seattle, and it feels a little bit the same because it disproportionately affects different populations, and it's a good lesson that probably people won't stop drinking sweetened beverages because we're still drinking a lot of porter, and they were drinking a lot of porter, so we'll see. A couple other things. Obviously, I'm a brewery owner, so, and I talked a lot with Kevin Forhan is here, who you don't also know, but he's also a legendary brewer here in Seattle. And he's been here since nearly the beginning of this kind of craft revolution. And he proposed a question, and I was thinking along the same lines, I think probably for different reasons, but we really care about the craft beer scene here in Seattle. We're still at the point where we're really passionate about what we do, and somehow we're surviving really well during a period of consolidation. I'm not sure if everyone here knows, but you write about in your book that AB InBev and SAB Miller merged in 2016. So they produce, I think you said,
New Belco, it's called, I think.
New Belco,
Yeah.
okay. It has a name.
It's like a monster.
Has an evil name.
It's the Beeromoth.
I didn't know that. Now I'll have nightmares. But you wrote in your book, one corporate entity is earning half of the total global beer profits and producing 1 of every 3 pints of beer sold worldwide. Yet at the same time, and there was just an article in The Atlantic yesterday that pertained to this, in the craft beer industry, let me look at the numbers here. Employment, brewery workers expanded by 120% in the last 8 years. And production, the number of breweries expanded by a factor of 6-fold. And this is during a recession when the total volume of beer consumption is actually falling. So during this kind of scary consolidation period, it's hard for us to tell, and you don't have to feel like you have the answer, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on, do you feel like there's room in the middle? Like the small breweries are doing okay, the large breweries are doing really well, but is there a middle ground? That seems to be kind of the shaky place.
Yeah, I think it really depends on how you define the middle. Like, there's some breweries like Sierra Nevada or New Belgium that are craft breweries, but they're also very large companies, and they're brewing, I think both of them are at least more than 1 million barrels. Yeah. Obviously, that's nothing compared to New Belco. Yeah.
But still very impressive.
But it's like, the people, they're not hobbyists, like they're businessmen, and they're producing beer at scale. And yeah. So I think that there are definitely room for companies like that. I mean, you do see the trend of the multinationals acquiring or purchasing ownership stakes in successful craft breweries. Mm-hmm. But you also see New Belgium is actually employee-owned, which I think is really cool. They're an ESOP. Yeah. And I think, so I do think there's room for large craft breweries. Yeah. And I think there's also, as you have mentioned in Seattle, is a good example of this, room for very small craft breweries that are just kind of neighborhood institutions. But at the end of the day, I think running a business is hard, and
Yes, it is.
there are gonna be exits from the market because not everyone has the right idea and can tap into the right marketplace. But it's a good time to be a craft brewer. Yeah. You've seen growth in that market basically since the 90s is the market share in terms of market share. So.
Well, that's hopeful. Thank you. That's a good answer. Kind of jumping around a little bit here, but I know that you said that one of your favorite chapters in the book is not everyone is a beer producer, but there are a lot of people who are involved in the production of the beer, the barley farmers, the hop farmers. We see that a lot here in Washington because we have a huge...
It's hops.
Yeah.
Producer.
And so they are really boom and bust, these hop farmers. Right now is a great time, but they've gone through some really hard times. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about
Yeah, absolutely. That chapter was really fun to write because I actually went to Slovakia and met with there's an economist there that was a close call about what changed after 1989. And it kind of blew my mind just in terms of really thinking through, like, we know there's capitalism and there's communism, and there's like one is free markets and the other is, a centralized economy where the government says you produce this much barley. And just like listening to the stories of what it's like to go through that change. And basically what happened in all the Eastern Bloc was that they were very focused on producing, like the governments were very focused on producing cheap grains because their priority was like we need to have a lot of just very basic, like cheap grains. Like that was a big focus. So they had more than market would, decide, like then demand would exist in a free market economy. And in 1989, it was basically like a huge free-for-all where just the rules were up. Like prior to that, profit was not a thing. Companies existed as much to produce what they're producing as they did to employ and be a livelihood for the people that worked there. So they were bloated. They had lots of workers that weren't doing much. And but also the supply chains were very regulated. So none of these people had ever had to make business decisions and take risks. It was all, the government tells you to produce this much barley and you will get this much money for it. And that's like guaranteed. So imagine going from that to like all bets are off. And also, not only that, but there weren't any institutional or legal institutions to make sure people were following the rules. So some barley farmers said they would, people would just not pay them, and they had no way of they couldn't take them to court. Like that didn't exist. That wasn't a thing. So there was just nothing, like no recourse. And so supply plummeted by a third in the years following 1989. I just want to find my card about this so I can get the numbers right. I can't find it. I'll just do it by memory. So supply plummeted by a third, and but at the same time, there are these beer multinationals. Back then, it was a little more fragmented. There was AB InBev, SAB Miller, Heineken, and Carlsberg, which are the four largest at the time, and they kind of just carved up the Eastern Bloc. They knew that they're a big beer drinking countries, especially Czech Republic and Slovakia. And so Heineken purchased Zlatý Bizant, which was the largest brewery in Czechoslovakia. And what they found was it makes the most sense to import barley locally. To not import barley, to source it locally. Like, it doesn't make economic sense to import it. And so what they discovered when they acquired these breweries is that they had to fix the entire supply chain. They couldn't just deal with the beer. They had to So they really had to go up to the barley farmers and invest in them and lend them money and set up long-term fixed price contracts for them. And it was really interesting because when I talked to the farmers, they said they did not seem that happy with the transition overall. In general, they had kind of an attitude of like, in the good old days, like, you know, barley,
Secure.
it was secure, but they really were happy with Heineken, and they were happy that they were able to get these long-term fixed price contracts. So Heineken did this, and what happened in the long term, though, is every year when you're in a fixed price, in a contract, so that it'll be like a certain percentage of the contract is, we're gonna pay you this no matter what. If there's a really good harvest and, you know, there's a surplus and the price of barley drops nationally, the top third or so will be market rate. So it's like either the farmer will get more money or less money depending on what the market is, but they can be guaranteed that they're gonna get this certain amount of money. And ironically, what happened is when Heineken made all these long-term investments in the barley farmers, when Slovakia joined the EU, they were entitled to the very generous cap subsidies as part of the EU. And so in that situation, Heineken actually was able to extract some of the surplus of the subsidies in the long run. Because in these negotiations, that's, you know, they know what the farmers are getting.
Great. So. Because we're two really tall women up here talking about beer, we should probably talk about a little bit women in beer, not go too crazy about it, but I really wanted to tie it to this idea of the influence of advertising on beer sales. I thought, first of all, the Dos Equis numbers were amazing. What?
The most interesting man in the world.
The number,
the most successful advertising campaign in the world.
It jumped like 85% production after that ad campaign, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah,
so you'll see Stoop on the news soon, or on TV really soon. But really, the part that I thought was really interesting was the time during the 50s when everyone was getting a television in their home. So they were kind of captive audiences for advertising. And then the link to sports. So sports advertising was mostly beer. And you didn't say this in the book, but I was just kind of curious. Do you think that tying of baseball and sports to beer advertising, do you think that led to any of the kind of stereotypes of women as non-drinkers? Because obviously we are.
Yeah.
I'm not, because I don't want to shake while I'm drinking it, but I really want this beer. But I'm a little nervous, so I'm afraid you'll see me do this.
Get it on the microphone.
But did that, I mean, if it didn't cross your mind, you feel free to say no, but I kind of made that link in my own head.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, there aren't any numbers in the book on this, and I don't know any numbers on it, so this is not evidence-based, but that makes sense to me. Yeah, I don't know if you want me to talk about that chapter, but
yeah, I would love to. It was really interesting.
It's a really interesting chapter. It's kind of incredible, just if you look at the chapter specifically focused on America, but when you look at all these other countries and you see how strong the correlation is between television advertising and brewery consolidation. In America specifically, we had the most dramatic consolidation in the world, like between 1950 and 1990, the market share of the largest four brewers went from 20 to 90%. One brewer was controlled 54%, that was Anheuser-Busch at the time, which was more than the 8 largest German breweries controlled of German market share. So it is a very dramatic difference that happened here and didn't happen in Europe. And there is consolidation in Europe, but nothing like that. And this economist, Lisa George, who this research is based on, what she was really interested in is the explanation for this was always technological improvements or very successful strategic advertising expenditures, which were made and paid off. And she said, there's an underlying connection here. I think it was the advertising technology that was the result of this. So the mechanism that happens is in a competitive ad market, equilibrium prices are tied to viewer. So prior to the rise of television, breweries' main way of advertising is that they would sponsor minor league baseball. Were actually some of the very first companies that got involved in TV advertising. They sponsored the scoreboards and the mascots, and they basically employed their old techniques with the new reality, the new media market, serve a small portion of the number of viewers that they're reaching. So their advertising cost effectively per viewer that they can realistically serve is much higher than a larger brewer. And it's like you can say that this happened during the same period of history and say, oh, that's just correlation, all these industries consolidated during that period of time. But Lisa George actually has data on this where she studies, there's a natural experiment in the FCC granting licenses. They began in 1941, and then there are two freezes, one during World War II and the other during the Korean War. And what she does is she looks at the markets that got the FCC licenses before and compares them to ones during these other periods and sees that actually there is a correlation, and the broadcast TV did actually kill the local breweries. So
we won't be on TV.
But now we're in a new reality where there are lots of other advertising opportunities. It's a totally different.
Facebook, Twitter.
Yeah, Facebook. It's been very good for small businesses.
Yes,
social
definitely.
Media marketing.
Definitely. Also wanted to touch on something that is kind of, for people who are really interested in beer, the Reinheitsgebot in Germany from, I think it's 1516. That law has been in the books since then. It's a really long time for a law about anything to be sustained, since 1516. And for people who are into beer, it's kind of this, it's a really important thing. We kind of think of it as the rules of beer, that you can only use these certain products in beer. But the reality is a lot different, that maybe this wasn't necessarily to protect beer, it was actually, it kind of crushed innovation in German beers. If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that when it was passed, it probably was to protect people.
Yeah.
Because
all the stuff being thrown in beers.
That was the 1500s, and people were, not familiar with all the laws of
what can kill you.
So this is based on the research of an economist named Frank van Tongeren, who's German, and he studied, and basically it did begin as a public health measure, but in 1987 there was a challenge after obviously the EU does not allow for tariffs. It's free trade within all these countries. And so in 1987, and in Germany, the Reinheitsgebot prior to this said that not only could German brewers not brew beer beer that did not follow these rules in Germany, but no beer could be sold in Germany unless it was brewed in accordance with the Reinheitsgebot. So in 1987, imported beers were less than 1% of the market share of the German
So they were successful, if you're German.
And a French brewery actually challenged this law in the European Court of Justice and called it a non-tariff trade barrier and said there were no legitimate public health claim. This was not a public health measure anymore. It served as a tariff. And they won. And the court had to rule that other breweries could sell non-Reinheitsgebot beer in Germany. German breweries still had to brew in accordance with the Reinheitsgebot because German's free to regulate it, and found that the the market share actually quadrupled to 4%.
Wow.
So that led this economist to conclude that the Reinheitsgebot was serving as a tariff or a protectionist policy, but all the same, Germans still don't really like non-German beer.
Yeah. Very traditional. I think we have, my timekeeper here says we have time for maybe one more question. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about Pierre Celis and Hoegaarden, because I think most people are familiar with that brand, that the wit beer style, but that was a dying style, and Pierre Celis kind of rescued it from obscurity. And then just the economics of what happened with that style are really interesting. So if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. It's like if you look at the Belgian white style, it traces so many different aspects of history. So just to begin, like way back in 937, which is when there was a war and the little town
We don't have
of
that much
Hoegaarden-
time.
What?
937, that's way far back. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, was actually it was decided they were part of the Prince Bishopric of Liège, which is it was like kind of a buffer state between the Habsburgs and the French Valois, so they like let it stay that way. So it was basically surrounded by Habsburg territory, but it was part of Liège. So that meant that in the 1300s, when there was a excise tax on all beer, they were exempt from that tax, and so they could make it cheaper. And it became a town that became famous for its beer. It had 2,000 people and 38 breweries. Its rival was Leuven.
Sounds like heaven.
What?
Sounds like heaven.
Its rival town over was Leuven, so it's so great because Leuven is the headquarters of AB InBev now, and it's where Stella Artois was created. They're both big, and they're really close to each other in Belgium, but they're both really big brewing towns back in the 1300s. And on the label of every Hoegaarden, you'll see the logo is a bishop staff and a brewer mash pedal, and this is due to this special tax exemption they had. So during the German occupation of Belgium in World War I, the lager style was introduced, and the brewery Stella Artois was started after, which brewed that clear. They called it Stella because it was bright and yellow like a Christmas star, and it basically during the 20th century, 1900s, rose, and Belgium was a place with like so many breweries and all these weird local styles. And what's so interesting now is we kind of revere Belgian beer as like great beer, like, you know, the peak of brewing. But back then they said they were like peasant beers, like that's how they saw the local styles, like these cheap, you know, weird farmers making like, you know, just doing whatever they had with like what they had been taught with what they had on site. And in Hoegaarden, that meant, you know, wheat, that meant coriander, that meant, so that was the style that developed. And Pierre Celis was a milkman in the town of Hoegaarden, and when the last brewery shut down, he said, you know, I have to save the style. So he decided to become a brewer. And he opened a brewery and began brewing white beer, and it was destroyed in a fire, and he didn't have many options, so he reached out to the brewery in nearby Belgium, Stella Artois Brewery, and said, do you want a stake in my brewery if you invest and help me rebuild? And they said yes, but then they merged with Jupiler, which is the other big lager brewery, and that meant the two of them together had a controlling stake, so they started putting all these requirements on him, like they were already angling to be like a massive brewer at scale. And they also trademarked the name Hoegaarden. So Pierre Celis was not happy with the restrictions being placed on how he ran his business. So he decided to move to Austin, Texas, where he started a brewery.
Did.
And the exact same thing happened, where he basically, all these suits came down and said, we want to start cutting costs. And so he left again, and he went back to Belgium. And like Celis White, which was like a cult classic, it had a very strong following in Austin at the time, basically folded because it was him that was leading it. So he went back to Belgium, and so and ironically enough, his brewery in the world, like this massive multinational through a series of mergers and acquisitions. And in 2005, they make the decision to move production, and Hoegaarden, the beer, is exported all around the world. That's why we have it. They move production of Hoegaarden out of Hoegaarden, the town. And there were mass protests, and people were very upset. And my co-author, Johan Swinnen, actually knows someone who was in charge of, at AB InBev, doing all of the testing, because they were very concerned that the move would change the taste of the beer with the water, and they said that blind tests, like no one could tell the difference. It was totally fine. But once they actually did it, like pretty much all of Belgium just kind of turned on them. And because previously they had seen InBev as like this kind of hometown big success. Like it was the company that was founded and started in their country and became, and after that happened, people said like, it's just not the same, it's over, like they turned on them.
That's because beer is partly magical.
Yeah. And it's
not
also, it just shows the role
you
taste.
can taste the
you know.
magic.
Yeah.
And his daughter recently reopened the brewery, I think.
Did she?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but yeah. She reopened it, I think in Austin. I'm not sure where, but we'll Google that when we're done. But thank you so much for talking to me. I know there are people who want to ask some questions, so we'll pass it on.
If you have a question, let's give it up for Devin and Robyn. Go ahead and come up to the microphone, and please ask your question as briefly as possible and in the form of a question. Thanks.
Hey, fantastic presentation. I'm from Ireland, and when I was growing up, life was good. I mean, when you're a student and you could give a pint of blood, and they give you half pint of Guinness at the. And if you're pregnant in hospitals, they give pregnant women Guinness as well because of iron. It has a large iron content. So they used to have this fantastic advertising that was Guinness is good for you.
Yeah.
And all through the history of beer, beer has been associated with health and safer drinking compared to water. Nowadays, wine has positioned itself as being good for your heart disease and so forth. Is there anything good for beer? do we have any good health cell that we can tell our wives that's why we must drink our beer?
Well, I can't, again, I'm not a doctor, but I have interviewed in the course of reporting for this book many food scientists and brewer trade associations, and at least one of them told me that he thought it was very unfair. Wine was more they invested a bunch of money in funding studies that would show wine to have health benefits, and that beer needed to catch up. So I think that there's hope yet.
Because in the early days, when water was not safe to drink,
yeah.
obviously beer was safer to drink than water.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Before people knew about bacteria, they knew that beer did not make them sick, so beer was a very important part of early European life.
And there are vitamins and minerals and awesome carbohydrates. There's your advertising.
Hello, thank you for the talk. You spoke both about the transition from the Soviet Union to a free market economy and also about the German Reinheitsgebot. And I'm wondering, in East Germany, how did the Reinheitsgebot interact with Soviet rule? Did it apply? Did the purity laws apply in East Germany? And was that part of the transition?
I don't know how whether Soviet law enforced East Germany. I do know one thing that happened, which is that after the wall came down, there was a big migration of East Germans, I think it was during that period, there were a big migration of East Germans into Bavaria, and they brought their non-Reinheitsgebot styles and caused a lot of discord and lots of mini lawsuits. So that's something.
I've always been puzzled by something. With all of the good beer around, why is it that there are still so many people that drink like Budweiser and Miller and all of those, and Coors and all of those things that taste so terrible?
Well, yeah, I have to say, this, reporting on this book and did give me a new perspective into those beers, because a thing that I think that gets lost when we talk about craft beer is that it was a really big, important innovation and achievement to be able to brew beer consistently on a massive scale. And so when lager spread, people were very excited about the fact that they knew what they were getting. It was clear. It always tasted the same. It was like a pure. It was like a pure commodity. And so I think that sometimes we need to take a step back and just say, that was an achievement. It was impressive that people figured out how to brew very consistently, and that happened with lager. And another thing that's kind of interesting is that they started using American style of beer. The goal was to make it low alcohol so that you could drink a lot during a sports game. That was what was considered
it's all
a
about
marketing
sports.
tactic. Yeah. You could drink 10 cans and you won't be totally trashed.
So I've read some articles that the conditions that allow France to have great wines, the conditions are shifting up north due to climate change. This is for both you. In Washington State, are you worried about the hops being affected, the source by the climate change? Both of you.
She said, do you know the answer to that? I think, yes, we do think about that. The hop farmers more than we do, because they're more on the ground dealing with that every day. But because we're so close to the hop farmers, we actually talk to them. That's something unique in Washington. We get to meet the farmers. Not a lot of brewers get to do that. And you can definitely see that it's a struggle to survive. Right now, it seems like that it must be great to be a hop farmer, but these are people that have done it for generations, and there have been some really difficult times. And I'm sure this change in climate, yes, is a concern. I think don't take me at my word for this, but I would think it'd be more of a concern for the grapes, because we're drying out a bit, and that works pretty well for hops. Not that I want to encourage climate change.
I do know, I interviewed some hops too cold, but it has to be far enough north that there are very long
I have a question about what you've found out about gluten-free beers. I have celiac disease and I have to be gluten-free. I'm pleased that Hales offers Seattle cider on tap, but I know that we have a fabulous gluten-free brewery here in Seattle, Ghost Fish, but I don't know how much you were exploring that in your own work.
I'm sorry, I don't know anything of. I do know they exist, but
I can say I have two sisters with celiac, so sadly they've never gotten to taste my beer. But we do have more and more gluten-free breweries, partly for those reasons and partly because some people think they can't eat gluten. If you feel that way, come talk to me, because I have some theories on that. But one thing that I thought from an economic standpoint, Ghost Fish Brewing, which is our local gluten-free brewery, they've done a good job of actually just, rather than just promoting that this is a gluten-free style, just selling it as beer, you know, and sometimes you come in with a preconception that it's a very different beer, and it is different, you know, depending on what fermentable you use, but there's some really great beers. It's improving quite a bit.
So I have a couple of questions. One is about fads. So if you're in Seattle, you know that in any bar you go into, you'll have between 1 and 20 IPAs on tap. And so I wonder what kind of effect that has on the economics. And also I'm wondering about regional differences. So in the Northwest, we have 20 IPAs on tap, but you go to Utah and it's hard to find an IPA. So I'm wondering about the economics of those things.
Let's see. I guess in general, it's hard to talk about the economics of fads. In America, the data shows that the demand for a greater variety of beers has been increasing since basically the 90s. We've seen also increase in market share of imported beers, in addition to craft beers, which obviously have a huge variety. I don't know about fads. The hops thing is definitely a thing. In terms of regional differences, it's basically what you'd expect, like California, Colorado, the Pacific Northwest, all have higher, and just the coast in general, higher market share of craft beers. The South is less so. But there is a craft beer market everywhere these days, especially cities.
Okay. So your book title is How Beer Explains the World. So how does beer explain the current state of affairs? Actually, you can answer that question, but my question is actually, what's your take on the major brewers buying more of the craft brewers and what their strategy is around that?
It's funny you say that because I just read a review of the book today that the main critique was that the title overpromised, because they're like, they didn't really accurately, like, they didn't give enough evidence that beer explains everything. There's just a couple chapters where it was consequential and a couple like political moments in Europe. And I was like, okay.
They need to drink more beer.
That's fair. I guess it's true. We did not prove that beer explains everything in the book. So if that's what you're expecting, don't buy it. Let's see. What was the second part? I'm sorry, I just forgot. Oh, what do I think about the brew? Well, again, I have like in writing this book just much more of an economic perspective. So I think that it's a good thing for craft brewers if they can get a larger distribution and have access to, like, scale will always increase the, amount of beer that can be brewed and distributed, and people that have access to it. So in that sense, I think it's a good thing. It's funny, like in every country, I feel like has their own little nuances, and in America, if you look back at our history, it seems like there's really a focus on authenticity, And we're the only country that has like a legal precedent around calling your beer imported if it was not imported, like if you just imported the brand, so to speak. And so I think that, there's a lot of talk about like, well, craft brewers aren't, once they're acquired or if they have a large ownership stake by a multinational, does that make them authentic anymore? And I think that, the better question would be like, do you want to support a local business? Like any other local business, it's the craft beer section of the market. While the overall the beer market is more concentrated than ever before, there's been a really steady amount of exit and entry into the craft beer market, so that there hasn't been like a significant consolidation there. There's still a lot of room for small players, and I think that's a good thing. And it doesn't seem to be changing. So, I mean, yeah, that's what I think. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, talking about that. Oh, you're going to ask a question? Okay.
Sorry. So I see that she's drinking a beer, but you're not. What do you drink beer? Do you?
I actually don't drink that much beer anymore, I have to say.
What? Okay. I just was going to ask you what your favorite beer was, just because you wrote about
when
beer.
I was living in Belgium, I did develop an appreciation for the Belgian beers. So I really like the Trappist beers. I really like Orval, Saint Bernardus 12. I really liked Triple Carmelite. It's since been acquired by a multinational. But back when I was there writing this book, it was a very small brewery.
So I think we have time for one more question, it looks like. It's you.
Yeah. I was just curious, you've talked a lot about Europe and North America. In the research for the book, did you find other regions of the world where beer consumption is really growing or had been really high and has declined compared to other types of alcohol?
Well, the largest beer market in the world right now is China, because it's the largest country in the world population-wise. But it's actually been like it's like that. And same with Russia and Brazil. They're all really quickly growing beer markets, and really big beer markets. So one of the chapters in the book is the rise of the fall of the beer drinking country, the rise of the beer drinking world. And what you see is that if you divide up countries into if you look at the share of alcohol they consume and how you divide it between beer, wine, and spirits, it breaks down on stereotypical lines of like Germany, most of their alcohol is consumed as beer. France, most of it's wine. Nordic countries, Russia, it's mostly spirits. And what you see is that all of the traditionally beer drinking countries, that share of alcohol consumed as beer is falling, and same with the wine and the spirits drinking countries, and they're all drinking more of what they didn't drink before. So all the like and that's why countries like Belgium have had to focus so much on, or breweries there have had to focus so much on an export market and exporting their beers around the world, because Belgians aren't drinking more beer, they're drinking less. But Chinese they're drinking a lot more beer, so.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Devin Briski, Robyn Schumacher. Devin will be signing books in the back of the room if you want to get a book signed, and Third Place Books is selling the books tonight. Thanks again and have a good evening.